This is an activity, these bi-monthly sessions that are brought to you by three cooperating institutions. The first one is the Judson Memorial Church, in which you are currently sitting. And that's by the decision of the minister here and the people who run this church. And I'm very proud to tell you that they tell me that what we do here is part of what they conceive to be the mission of their church, which is not every minister who probably feels that way. The second entity is the Left Forum, that institution that has been bringing you those large conferences every spring for 30 years. And the third one is Democracy at Work. That's the one that literally puts these together, produces the video, which is being done by our video man in the back. And I want to say a word or two about the video production. I'm going to read it from my phone because we didn't have a chance to print off what I have to say, so bear with me if I look down. I won't do that the rest of the evening. We put this event, we call this the GCLEU, which no one will remember, Global Capitalism Live Update. I guess that's what it is. GCLE, Live Economic Update. I can't even do it. Okay, it's put up on YouTube, usually within about 24 hours. Thanks again to Brian. But we also have it at a place that I want to make sure you all know about, in hopes that some of you, if you're not already there, will consider going to it. This is a service called Patreon, P-A-T-R-E-O-N. I assume many of you know about it. If not, let me explain. It's a service for nonprofit organizations like ours. And what we do is we put a bunch of material up there, videos, audio files, all kinds of stuff, and they're available, and what you are asked to do is basically support, virtually at any level you want. It's on a monthly basis, and it provides a stream of revenue to us, which allows us to plan and do the various things we're doing here, because it's a regular stream. It's one of the ways that the internet has helped organizations like us by creating this very easy way. You sign up once, and then for as long as you are comfortable doing it, and then the money is taken every month, $1 or $2, $3, whatever it is, that you can afford to give, if you can afford to do that. So I wanted you to know that if you're willing or interested in doing that, you just go to patreon.com, P-A-T-R-E-O-N, patreon.com/GCLEU, and that'll take you right there, and it'll explain everything there that you might want to do. Separate from that, it goes up on YouTube, and there, if you watch it there, which, by the way, we average between 50 and 100,000 every time we do this. So you will be, you're here for the live event, but the really huge audience is global that watches this every other month, and has now for quite a while. But for those people, it's even more urgent that they go to patreon.com, which is why I'm saying it, /GCLEU, because it's their way of helping to pay. They are not here, so they don't give the $10 that we ask of you, but they could support us through Patreon, and it would be enormously helpful to everything we do. And if you go to YouTube, you just subscribe. That doesn't cost any money. You just check in. There's a little place to check, a little bell, and then you get updates. Every time something is added by us to there, you get a little notification on your phone, which you can pursue or not as you like. We have also begun, because of interest, to produce podcasts that are available on the major platforms for podcasts. So, for example, our weekly radio show is available on a podcast. It's available on Apple Podcasts, on Google Play. Some of you know what these platforms are. All of this is available there. But we're also producing additional regular podcasts. And Three of them that I want to bring to your attention besides our own programming. The first is by a person who works with us in Puerto Rico called Puerto Rico Forward. It's a regular program of what's going on in Puerto Rico from the general perspective that we have here. If you're interested, it's called Puerto Rico Forward, and you can find it again on all these platforms and always through our website, democracyatwork.info, where all of this is laid out for you to get to. The second one is Capitalism Hits Home. Some of you may know that I have once a month, roughly, a practicing psychotherapist, Harriet Fraud, who appears on the program with me. And we basically talk about what we sometimes call the tale of two depressions, one economic and the other one psychological, on the premise that the two are intimately related as cause and effect each of the other. And we explore that, me, the economist, she, the psychotherapist, and a lot of people find that interesting. And the podcast she's now producing on her own is called Capitalism Hits Home. And you can pursue that. And the third one, we just launched this week, is called Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, and is presented on a regular basis by Professor David Harvey of the City University of New York, someone who is a major figure in the circle of Marxist thinkers. And so we're very happy that he has expressed an interest, and he produces these on a regular basis, and they are also available on podcasts. All of these can also be accessed through the Patreon system, also through our website. And we basically are letting you know because we'd like you to make as much use of these as possible with financial donation if that's possible, without if it isn't. Okay, last thing is when we're done tonight, we always could use some help in putting away the chairs. So we have an agreement with the church. The chairs are actually stacked in that room over there. We bring them out so that you can all sit down, since we assume it's more comfortable than lounging around the floor. And so we also have to put them back when the evening is over. Okay, so what I would like to start with, as usual, is 2 or 3 shorter economic updates, monthly economic updates. Chairs, if folks have a chair that's empty next to them, could you just raise your hand so those coming in? Okay, so there's plenty of opportunity wherever you go. Okay, thank you. A few short ones, and then we're going to get into the major topics that were on the announcement that I assume most of you got. So let's do some of the short ones first. And by the way, some of you have asked me, how are these chosen? It's just me. I look around me, I read the newspaper, I don't watch television, I can't stand it, but as best I can, I try to keep up with what's going on. And it's what really kind of grabs me as something that needs analytic attention. And it's just a choice mechanism that I make. Okay, so in no particular order, let me begin with the sad spectacle that I'm sure at least many of you are aware of, that the city of New York and the state of New York, alongside a city and a state of Virginia, have just sold out to the Amazon Corporation. And it is really important to understand what that's about, both in the larger picture and in the specifics. Let's start with the specifics. The project is to build a second, or at least that's what they said, Amazon to build a second headquarters. It's based in the Northwest, as you know, I assume you know. And so it's going to have a second headquarters in the East. Turns out they are going to have 2 second headquarters, which in another language would be called a second and a third headquarter, but for some reason they need to have a second that's twice. The cost, the amount of money they're going to spend to build these 2 headquarters is this is all from the New York Times, $10.5 billion. That's an awful lot of money. Well, it's an awful lot of money depending on your perspective. If you are the CEO of Amazon, a man named Bezos, whose personal wealth is $160 billion, then this is nothing. But for the lowlifes like you and me, it's considerable. $10.5 billion bucks. But here's the really good news for Amazon. $5 billion of it, they're contributing. The other $5.5 billion, you are contributing. It's really important you understand that. You, the taxpayers of New York, which I assume most of you are, together with your brothers and sisters in Virginia, are footing the bill for more than half the cost of this project. That's money coming out of taxes, mostly. Taxes that are already been paid, that are now going to be shoveled to them, and taxes that they would have had to pay as citizens of this area, which they will not now have to pay, in some cases for years, many years. It means, therefore, that either we all will have to pay more taxes because whatever those taxes were used for before, they won't be used for anymore because they're going to build a headquarters for Amazon. Or if we're not going to pay more taxes, then it means the government has lost that revenue and can't use it for schools and hospitals and roads and firefighters and all the rest of it that the government is required to do. And so we will suffer a deterioration in the quality and quantity of public services available to us. So it comes directly out of us. In another time and place, it would be called by what it is. It is a mammoth subsidy. So let's now be clear. More than half the cost of the private headquarters of a private company whose job it is to maximize its private profits, more than half the cost of the investment that's going to generate wonderful profits to them is being paid for by you. In return for your really generous contribution of more than half the cost of this project, what portion of the profits Amazon earns will you get in view of the enormity of your contribution? Nothing. Zip. You get to watch the building. You will not get to go into it unless you have a security pass, and that's a whole nother story. But you will get to look at it. And my guess is with that amount of money, the shrubbery will be beautiful. And so you can go to Long Island City where it is planned to be built, and you can stare at the shrubbery, and my guess is, I'm not sure, that there will be no charge. But of course you will be staring at the most expensive tulips you've ever seen, which you personally have helped pay for, even though they're in someone else's garden. This is extraordinary stuff. But yes, sir.
In addition, I don't know if people realize it, on Staten Island they have already built an enormous distribution center.
Yes.
Up and running.
Yes. And another
Also subsidized
by gifts. They always get gifts. But this is on another order of magnitude, the amounts of money that are being given to them. Okay, next thing to see in this. This was the end of a process. Amazon really played it to the hilt. They announced, I think a year and a half ago, but at least a long time ago, that they were planning to build a second headquarters. And they invited, there is no shame here, none. Don't look for subtlety, don't look for nuance, none of that. They informed the American cities. Which American cities? All of them. That you can bid, ladies and gentlemen, mayors, city councils, governors, you can bid for us to come to your city. What do you bid with? Well, I just told you. New York and Virginia bid with $5.5 billion. And before they settled on Virginia and New York, other cities and towns and states were in their offering too. In order for them to come to New York and Virginia, it was necessary for New York and Virginia to give even more than anybody else was. Other people stopped at a certain point because the mayor or the governor of another state said, "Oh, this looks terrible. I better not offer everything." But there was no hesitancy on the part of Mr. Cuomo, or unfortunately, Mr. de Blasio either. They gave it all. They gave as much, yes?
On the news, they said that Amazon would end up giving back to the city something like $13 billion.
Yeah, yes, I'm coming to that. Bear with me. So we outbid other cities. We gave away more of the city's taxes to a private company than others were willing to do. Let's hear it for New York. Wow. Now the rationale. The basic rationale always is do this thing, ready? It will bring jobs. This is like a magic. Whatever shenanigan you're doing, cover it over with a thick layer of, it will bring jobs. Because apparently opposition melts. It's like holding up garlic to the devil. The devil just dissolves. Has such an aversion to garlic. So all opponents are supposed to drop dead with any thought of opposition the minute we are told it will bring jobs. Well, I've been doing this for 50 years. This is a scam. 99% of the time, the number of jobs they bring is trivial, as it is in this case, and I will explain that in a minute. But the thing to understand is nobody ever checks. There's no reason not to say, it'll bring jobs, because there is no agency of the government that gives us a report 2 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later. What was the promise? What was the result? So if I ask any of you in this room, including any professional economists, give me the results of the following 6 examples of a company getting a fortune in subsidies by promising jobs. Give me the results. You can't, because you don't have them. There's no place to go and publish them. None of it. Well, the New York Times, clearly not an enemy of any of this, usually a cheerleader for this sort of thing, announces that the number of long-term jobs that the Amazon headquarters are likely bring is 2,500. That's trivial, people. If that's the truth, well, I have no reason not to believe it. We have a lighting problem. Yes, okay. If that's the truth, then this is the most expensive 2,500 jobs in the history of the world. There are additional jobs, not counted in the 2,500, which are the construction jobs, because you have to build the buildings and all of that. And here's a very sad thing about a labor movement that I support and that I love, but that in this case needs a rap on the knuckles. The construction trades will get some jobs, no question. They actually will get some jobs. They don't last very long. They'll last as long as it takes to build the building. But they are often able to be brought in to celebrate along with the politicians, like de Blasio and Cuomo, because they are so happy to get these jobs, even if they don't last all that long, that for them it's, oh good, it really is jobs, and so they support it. Not wanting to face, even though I'm sure they know, that the jobs that those construction workers will get will come at the expense of $5.5 billion that the public will not have available to serve its needs, and either come up with more taxes to replace that money or suffer the loss of the public services that would have been provided if that money had not been given to Amazon. And again, $5.5 billion for New York is a lot of money covering a lot of services. $5.5 billion is 3% of the personal wealth of Jeffrey Bezos. If ever there was an example that the company doesn't need to squeeze the public, which is already squeezed because we don't have enough for our schools and we don't have enough for half the things the government does. If ever that was the case, it is the case now. Mr. Jeffrey Bezos is very proud. He is the richest man on the planet. If we took away $5 billion for him so that the city wouldn't have to pay it, he'd still be the richest person in the world. But we don't do that in this system. He has to be the richest person in the world without losing the $5 billion would have still left him, in order that we all can be deprived of public services and or pay higher taxes. It isn't surprising that Mr. Bezos pulls this kind of stunt. That's how he got to be where he is. The only mystery is why we all allow this. Shame on us, not on him. He's doing what capitalism leads people to do when they get the chance. He has that chance. He's going to milk it for all he can get out of it. And then the final question. What will be the payback, as per the question? What will they do? Well, my guess is they will do what they have already been doing. This is a company that distributes things. I don't mean to make little of it, although I do enjoy that. That's what they do. They deliver things. They've learned how to organize the computer to deliver it quickly and with considerable efficiency. Wonderful. What that's got to do with giving a single person $160 billion is a total mystery to me. And if any of you can help me understand that, I'd be much obliged. For me, that is a perversion of the economic system, if I ever saw one. I do want to remind you, in case you've never done the work, if you take $160 billion, which is what he has, and you give it to a hedge fund, which is what he does, to manage it for you, which is what all people like that do, let's assume he earns 5%. By the way, he should do considerably better than that. Most hedge funds offer and do better than that, but I'm being very conservative. If he invested at 5%, his $160 billion, it means that he will earn each day, 5% on $160 billion, $22 million a day, 7 days a week, 365 days. That piece of information helps to explain why he doesn't buy lottery tickets. Because he doesn't need to. He wins it every day anyway. $22 million a day, every day. It's exhausting. But he just demanded from New York and got a subsidy of New York and Virginia, a subsidy of $5.5 billion. It is a testimony to the insanity of this economic system and how it works and how it distributes wealth. And it will cost everybody in this room considerably. Long term, Amazon will make profits. That's why it does what it does. And it will decide, because it has to, what to do with the profits. One of the ways it can calculate, it can say, we may, there's no constraint on them, we may invest it in the area where our headquarters is. Clearly, they are not investing it where their first headquarters is, that's Seattle. So if they told that to Seattle, and my guess is they did, well, then it didn't work out. The next growth is somewhere else. By the way, one of the reasons they have to leave Seattle and they can't stay in Seattle is because large numbers of people in Seattle hate them. And by the way, the hatred is complicated. But one of the chief sources of the hatred, which you're all going to feel too, is real estate. Because when Seattle comes in and hires large numbers of people, particularly people at high salaries, they want to live nearby. So suddenly, the house prices and the apartment prices go through the roof, which means anybody who was living there, who thought he or she could stay there for a while with a rent that wouldn't do more than go up 5-10% a year, that's bad enough, are suddenly going to discover that they have to move somewhere else. in our economic system, this displacement of people is not the problem of Amazon. They're the cause, but they are not required to bear one iota of responsibility for the damage they do, the lives they upend, the economic of rentals, which can destroy families and all the rest. Not anything they have to worry about. And you can betcha that if they bring in another X thousand high-paid people, 2,500 as the Times suggests, those people will all be pushing up real estate values in whatever neighborhoods they choose to live in. Yes?
Yeah, quick question. Since it sounds like such a bad deal now for just 2,500 permanent jobs, why would Cuomo and de Blasio go with it? Does that just by implication mean they get a kick?
The Times said 2,500. 2,500. I checked twice because it was so absurd.
Why would they go with it? Does that?
Well, that's a
they
good.
get
Why do why did so many politicians in so many cities and states bring it?
They thought they'd get a lot of jobs, but now that
No, it isn't really even that. It's not a lot of job because no one measures it. No one keeps track. No one will ever know whether the promises were kept or not. And by the way, occasionally, if someone comes, a clever reporter comes 2 years later and says, there's only 4, then they will get a long explanation of how conditions change and the circumstances and the tariffs, and but the point is, it's a private enterprise. It can do whatever the hell it wants.
It's the same reason they bid for the Olympics.
That's right.
Disaster, but it's a good public relations.
It's you're the leader, and you're bringing jobs. If you look at the New York Times photo from, I think it was yesterday, there's a smiling Cuomo sitting right next to a smiling de Blasio. I mean, the smiles, the whole picture is smiles. This is what politicians are asked to do. We have a society that defines the politicians by the success he or she has in bringing business into our community, the conditions of that business, the ramifications for the tax situation, for the living conditions of people. That's lost. That's a detail that's underneath, buried in the story in the last paragraph. The big picture, I'm bringing business, which reduces to I'm bringing jobs. But the cost of doing that is kept away. Yeah.
I understand that the average Amazon employee makes something like $28,000 a year, but that this agreement, supposedly Amazon is saying that the average salaries will be $150,000.
Yeah. When companies tell you what the average salary is of their people, turn off your hearing aid. It's all junk. It depends on how you count. If you're counting only headquarters personnel, then you're not counting all the miserable folks who work in those distribution centers, who work forklift trucks for 10 hours a day and get $12 an hour and stuff like that. If you bring them in, then you get the low numbers, $28,000. But the New York Times was full of stories about how headquarters workers are mostly going to be these There again, it's a hustle because the employees of Amazon are the ones that have the high jobs. All the menial work, the janitor work, the gardening, that's subcontracted out. And they're not telling you those wages because they're not technically employees of Amazon. They're employees of the temp gardening company, which gives immigrants without papers $6 an hour. And it tells them to be happy they got that, because if they don't accept that, ICE will be at their door tomorrow morning. So they don't have to count that because they subcontract. And by the way, in case you're wondering, they specifically subcontract not because it's efficient, not because it saves them money, but for PR purposes, for these purposes, to be able to say our basic salary, our average salary is this nice high number, because we've deftly moved the others off. During the gubernatorial race between Mr. Cuomo and the actress from Sex and the City, Cynthia Nixon, I don't know if you all caught it, but she was reporting, as she was required to, her money coming in, and it was little contributions ranging from $10 to $25. Whereas Mr. Cuomo had a dozen people giving him more money than he needed. This didn't look good. Cynthia Nixon correctly said, you know, he's being funded by rich people, I'm being funded by... So he got caught at what I'm about to tell you. He arranged for donors to not give him $10,000, but to arrange with their employees, their friends, their relatives, to give the same amount of money, but in little contributions, so it would look as though he was getting money from little people too. There's no end to this. You live in this system, it's playing with you. And it just hopes you don't look at it, because who wants to look at this? It's friggin' ugly, isn't it? But part of my job is to rub your nose in it a little. Yes?
The system doesn't say it, but the newspapers don't say anything, that this richest man on earth in Amazon paid no federal income taxes at all. And they made a lot of their profits by not charging any sales tax on their deliveries that keeps the city out of pay. They're building up an infrastructure where all the other businesses was kowtow to them or else get out of business.
Right, which is what Walmart did in its way before. And yeah, it's the same game all the time. Amazon has fought in other countries, the big strikes and movements in many European countries and elsewhere where they fight against them. The unions take a much stronger position. The unions are in Amazon. Amazon can't function without them, partly because the unions are so strong in many of these European countries that Amazon can't get into the country unless it signs a contract that it accepts the union. If they don't sign the contract, the politicians won't let them in. And then they do it, by the way. When they're forced to, they do it. The thing they claim they can't afford to do here, they manage to afford nicely everywhere else. You cannot believe a word. The only thing you could believe about these companies would be what you saw in their books. But being private capitalist enterprise, they don't have to show you their books. So everything you know about what their costs and wages are, you relying on them. And that's nuts. Don't do that unless you want to believe what they have. A special department. I have students of mine who work in the public relations department of those kinds of corporations. They're professional liars. That's their job. And they're well paid for it too. Some of the stories I tell you, I got from them. Because I didn't know. I've not done that kind of work in my life. And when the students told me, you know, I do this. I make this crap up. I explain, if we outsource the janitors, then we can claim that we don't have anybody get paid that crappy, because we've just hired someone else to pay crappy. So we don't have to account for it. But in fact, a proper accounting would say, okay, how much are the people paid who do the janitorial work? Which, by the way, in these large distribution centers, it's enormously important. You can't run those distribution centers if you don't keep the clean. Some of those are robots, you know, you cannot have an impediment. They don't know how to handle that. So it has to be kept very, very clean. There's an army of people that do that. And they get paid very poorly. So you keep them off your book. You subcontract. And by the way, sometimes you subcontract it to what? To a company that provides janitorial service, which, when you check out its board of directors, is led by the second cousin of somebody working at the same company, because it was set up for this purpose. The money to set up that business was provided often by the company that thereby escapes keeping the records. Anyone who tries to defend this system looking at statistics, your only response should be a very carefully articulated sneer. And when they look at you funny, why are you sneering? Tell them. Okay. And by the way, this is as common as anything. It goes on in every major city all the time. In every city I've ever lived, there's somebody called an economic development officer or an economic development team or something like that. And that's their job. You know what they do? They develop charts and statistics and little booklets and reports. And they have it like a traveling show. And they go to corporations and they put on their show, like little children, show and tell. come to our city. We've got this wonderful empty land where we can, and not only that, we have the power of eminent domain, if you all know what that is, the power of the city or of the state to take a piece of land from the owner, even if the owner doesn't want to sell it. The city has the right to determine what the fair market value is and tell that person, we're buying your land at that price, and the person in question can't do anything about it. Some of you believe that we have a system of private property. No, we never have. We talk an endless line about private property, but in fact we have all kinds of exceptions and exemptions, and municipal buying, eminent domain is one of them. By the way, the law there will surprise you. The law says if it is determined that it's in the community's interest for a piece of land to be used for some other purpose than it is currently being used for, the city can go in, force the sale, and move it to the other purpose. There was a woman running for lieutenant governor in California this last election, Gail McLaughlin. You may have heard her name. She was the mayor of Richmond, California, one of the suburbs of San Francisco. And in her capacity as mayor of the Green Party, she was elected to mayor on the Green Party line. And in her effort as mayor, which made her famous, she proposed to use eminent domain against the single largest corporation in Richmond, which was the Chevron Oil Company. And to use it against them, and also to use it to buy, it was a very clever idea. There were a lot of people in Richmond, it's a working class town, a lot of people in Richmond who had borrowed money to buy a home in the go-go days, 2000 to 2007. And when the crash came in 2008, like it happened in many cases, the value of these houses collapsed. So many of them were living in a house that was worth less than the amount of money they owed the bank on that house they were living in. So they couldn't sell it because there wouldn't have been enough money to pay back the bank. Then they would have been stuck with more money to pay the bank for no house at all. There's one thing worse than paying the bank when you're in the house, which is paying the bank when you're not in the house for that house. So she had this clever idea. She would go in and the city would buy land and property and then turn it over to the people, because that would be good for the community to not have people underwater, it's called, when you're in that situation. So she was very clever, was very clever to use it, freaked Chevron out, did everything they could to get rid of her. But they couldn't, because she had built up a basis of support, which is why she ran for lieutenant governor. She did not win, but she did a credible thing. California is a remarkable place right now. The things are going on there that the rest of us ought to take our hats off and thank. Los Angeles had on the ballot, and we're going to come back to the election in a few minutes, but Los Angeles had on the ballot, if you're not familiar with it, a bill to create a public bank that would be run, owned and operated by the city of Los Angeles in direct competition with private banks. And if the private banks weren't doing something that the community needed, the public bank would do it. They were going to do that for Los Angeles the way the Bank of North Dakota already does that for the state of North. You all know that, right? No? Some of you are looking at me. North Dakota has a public bank. It's the only state of the 50 states in the United States that has a bank owned and operated. When the people of North Dakota pay their taxes each year, or their income taxes, or their property taxes, or they pay for a fishing license or a driver's license, all that money doesn't go into a big New York bank the way it does everywhere else. It goes into the Bank of North Dakota, owned and operated by the state of North Dakota. If that bank makes a profit during the year, it takes the profit and hands it back to the government of North Dakota, which therefore doesn't have to tax its people as much as it otherwise would, because it's getting the profit from the bank. Needless to say, with private banks, they don't do that. Moreover, the bank is required by North Dakota law. I can see many of you don't know. Good. The bank is required by North Dakota law to give its loans to North Dakota individuals and North Dakota businesses, because it's a North Dakota bank. Kind of makes a certain sense. And here's stuff you might really enjoy. This North Dakota bank was created in 1916. It's over 100 years old. During that time, occasionally, big banks, usually from New York, have gone into North Dakota and tried to persuade people and, fund politicians to attack it, which they have occasionally attacked it. They could never, ever end it. Neither Republicans nor Democrats. Because the people of North Dakota want it, and that's why it's there for 100 years. And North Dakota is not a big liberal state in America. It's a conservative, usually Republican state, and that made no difference. Even when the banks came in and said, that's socialism, this made the people of North Dakota giggle. They weren't intimidated, they didn't freak out, they didn't go, oh my goodness, we shouldn't do that. Suddenly, when they could see the practical benefit to them of having their own bank, of not paying fees to banks out of the state, who are typically the ones who get this kind of business, they understood what there was at stake for them, and they kept it. The only, of course, interesting question is, why only North Dakota? What happened to the brains and the interests of the other 49 states? Well, for a long time they didn't dare, because this anti-public ideology that suffuses this country worked. But that has broken down, and in the last 8 or 9 years, there are initiatives all over the United States, some at a state level and some at a municipal level, to set up their own banks. The one that's furthest along is Santa Fe, New Mexico. They will probably be the next public bank, will be in that. That's the capital of New Mexico. Very strong movement there, has the support now of an increasing number of politicians. And by the way, in Los Angeles, the head of the city council, whose name escapes me now, is on the record in favor of it. That was one of the, and it got 43% of the vote. So they didn't get it. This was the first time it was on the ballot, but the first time with all the publicity against it, 43% of the vote, not bad. They keep up. If they keep up with it, they'll get it. They'll get it. And they have a strong group of people. By the way, I don't want to spend time on it, there is something called the Institute for Public Banking in the United States. And the leader of that, and the thinker who produces a lot of the work, is a woman named Ellen Brown, just like it sounds, the color brown. If you're ever interested in this, go look her up on Google, Ellen Brown. She writes a lot about these things, and she has a nice team of people working on this Institute for Public Banking, and that's a movement that is growing in the United States, particularly the last few years. All right, moving on. I want to talk about a parallel between two things that you might not have seen as parallel, both of which are in the news. One is, of course, Mr. Trump. That is the news in this society, so that's not so surprising. But the other big item in the news is Brexit, this situation in Great Britain. And I wanted to, just to make sure you have some sense of the parallels here. If you look at the level, for example, of wages, real wages, in the 10 years since the crash of 2008, they've been stagnant mostly here, flat, go nowhere. But in England, they've gone down 10%. It's really bad. The English working class has really suffered. It suffered in the crash, and the word recovery that you hear here all the time, you do not hear that in England. I mean, there's some of it, but nothing like what you hear here. And so when the election came a couple years ago, the British working class was so angry. By the way, not just at the Conservatives, who are the government in England, but the Labour Party that had been there before. Gordon Brown, some of you may remember, Tony Blair, they were hated as much as, because they were all running the country as the crash happened and as the working class suffered the austerity policies afterwards. So when the election came up, do the British stay in Europe? You had a peculiar thing. Right-wing politicians smelled an opportunity, and they turned out to have been right. The mass of people was so angry that the right-wing politicians could say, one of the things that's really causing you a problem, one of the really important things that's explaining the difficulty you're having in your job, in your income, in making life work for you, is the result of competition for your jobs from immigrants. This should sound familiar. Now, it's a little different there because the immigrants are mostly white. They don't have other colors. They're Eastern Europeans and a whole group of others that have did move into England for work. They had very little to do with the deterioration of conditions for the English working class, but it was a good choice. The English working class got enraged at immigrants, but more than immigrants, because they're not that dumb. More than immigrants, they were enraged at the elite that had been running England, both the Labour Party elites and the Conservative Party elites. So when the Conservative Party said, okay, with all this noise about immigrants, let's vote about whether we want to stay in Europe or not, being completely convinced that, of course, nobody in England would be so silly as to imagine that leaving Europe is going to solve your problems. What they didn't count on was that the mass of people were so angry at them, the leadership, the elites, that when they saw the Conservative Party saying, of course we're going to stay in Europe, and the Labour Party limping along and saying, yes, we should stay in Europe, they took their collective middle fingers and they said to the leadership, watch, and they voted to leave. They didn't vote to leave because leaving is an economic program. It isn't. It makes no sense at all. England's economic situation is already worse because of what it's doing, and it will become even worse when they have a Brexit of whatever form they do. They announced today that the cabinet has supported Theresa May, the prime minister, which doesn't mean they're going to do it, but it's moving along. They voted out of rage and anger and disappointment. And I think that's exactly why Mr. Trump is president. They hated the Clintons, they hated the Bushes. These are the people who, right and left, did the work over the last 25 years that made this the most unequal advanced industrial country in terms of income and wealth. Didn't make any difference whether the Republicans or Democrats were there, or put it otherwise, whatever difference it made wasn't big enough for anybody to really notice. So they voted for Mr. Trump because he's a big, loud mouth, yelling at immigrants and basically saying, I'm different. I'm not like all the other people. They're all couth and I'm uncouth, you know? And that's why he presents himself every day as uncouth, so we can all understand whatever else he is, he's not like those other people. Not only that, they did the work for him. You remember, Hillary Clinton kept saying, boy, you are odd, or you are weird, or exactly, thank you. You're doing my work for me. That you don't like me will get me another 1 million votes. You know, it's sad. But it really is the same. Voting for Mr. Trump doesn't solve the problems of the American working class, no way at all. And voting to leave Europe doesn't solve the problems of the British working class. It's crazy what they're doing. It makes no sense at all. And a lot of them know it. Just like a lot of Americans know that the people who voted for Trump, as you could already see in the midterm elections, are beginning to rethink some of that, which is why the Democrats were able to get back one of the two houses. We'll come back to that later. Next little short item. I got to be careful that I'm running out of time. Oil. I don't know how many of you watch, but the price of oil has really collapsed in the last few days. It's very important that you understand it's a basic commodity in the world. Why is that happening? That's the important thing. It's happening for two reasons. And we like this in economics because it's nice and neat. It's because of the supply and it's because of the demand. First, the supply. The biggest addition to supply is the United States. Fracking produces a quantity of oil and gas that is huge and is just being pushed into the world market and is more than enough then to drown out whatever cutbacks in producing oil might happen in the Middle East or Africa or Venezuela because of the problems those countries have. And the end result is there's too much oil being attempted to be sold. By itself, that probably wouldn't have made a big difference, some. But it's happening together with, and this is the important thing, a decrease in demand. Why? Because the global economic system is slowing down. We are headed into a time of major economic decline and trouble. Some of you have asked me in previous months to give more advice that'll help you decide what stocks to buy or not to buy. There are laws that prevent me, by the way, from doing that, and they're good laws in the sense that without knowing your circumstances, anybody gives you advice, you just stop talking to that person, because everybody's situation is unique, and the advice you get should be based on a real knowledge of your situation, what you want, what you have, and so on.
Law only stops you if you collect money for doing it. You can feel free to tell us whatever you want as long as you don't make us pay for it.
Well, that's not what BAI tells me. I've been told not to ever do that. Anyway, it's another conversation. Okay, so the demand. The slowdown in the economy is for three basic reasons. But actually, before I tell you what the reasons are, let me tell you, make sure you understand. That's not me that's saying the economy is going to slow down. You live in a society that has a serious set of psychological problems. You already know that. I am now going to tell you about some others you might not have known about, right? We live in an economy in which a dominant position in the media is held by the political leadership, as you can see, even Mr. Trump. It's in the interest of whoever is running the company to say that the economy is either doing wonderfully or about to doing wonderfully or recovering so that it will do wonderfully shortly. That wonderfully is the key word. Therefore, if it is in fact doing badly, they're going to tell you with more intensity how wonderful it is. Or, to use another more technical term, there's going to be a lot of denial going on, which is understandable because who wants to say or face the fact that economic circumstances are deteriorating? You already have enough financial problems. You don't want to hear that more are coming. Unfortunately, I have to tell you, more are coming. But it's not just me. I'm going to just give you three of many sources, because the disconnect these days, these last few months, between the financial press, which I read as a part of my job, and the public media press that you all get, the gap between them is, I've never seen it like this. So over the last 2 months, just to pick three, UBS used to be the Union Bank of Switzerland, one of the great banks in the world. They've just announced that one of their leading funds, they take money from rich people, basically, and they create funds which they then invest for those rich people to become richer still, which seems to be an important desire on the part of those kinds of people. I don't see anyone nodding, so I guess there's none of them here. The UBS just announced yesterday that in its major fund, it is reducing, I'll use their language, reducing the exposure to equities. That means the proportion of their fund invested in stocks from 50% to 20%. Now, you only do that if you think that the excrement is about to fly into the cooling equipment, right? That's what you, yeah, that's good. I didn't expect it. That's like Trump when he was lecturing to the UN. He didn't expect them to be laughing at him. I hope you're laughing with me. Another example, J.P. Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, that's the largest bank in the United States now, J.P. Morgan Chase. They've predicted, which is really nutty to do, but gives you an idea, that we will have a downturn by early 2020. That's less than 18 months from now. Okay? And Goldman Sachs is already advising its clients to move from equities to fixed income, and only the most secure, cautious kinds of fixed income, and to hold an increasing amount of cash. You know, cash doesn't pay interest, and cash doesn't get you dividends. What cash gets you is safety. And they're worried. They don't want you even to buy treasury securities because they expect those to go down, and fairly sharply too. So if UBS and Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase think the economy's turning down, then it's not me that's saying it. It's a consensus of the people whose job it is to invest money for rich people based on what they think is going to happen in the economy. And they think the stock market is going down because the underlying economy is in deep trouble. Being made worse by the inability of the United States to face anything. Imagining that if you put tariffs against the Chinese and others, it will kind of not matter. Well, it does matter. The Chinese are kicking back. The Chinese are taking all kinds of steps to escape this. And they're doing a pretty good job of it, too. The New York Times cheers the Chinese are really suffering. By the way, they are suffering. But they're doing their share of pushing that suffering back on the United States. That, too, hurt Mr. Trump in the elections. This is a society not facing its problems, denying that it has these problems. The worst thing you could do in this situation is to raise interest rates. Why? Because it makes it more expensive to buy a car, so people will do less of it. It makes it more expensive to buy a home, so people will do less of it. It makes it more expensive to use your credit card, so people will do less of it. It makes it more expensive to borrow to go to college, so people will do less of it. That's not good for the economy. None of that is. Yet they're going to do it. The next interest rate increase is scheduled for December. The Federal Reserve has said it will do that December. That's not very far away, folks. Why would a country have to do that? Because it's got so many problems it has to deal with that way that it can't afford not to do it, even though not doing it is kind of what you ought to do. That's when a society is in real trouble, when it has major economic problems and it can't find a way out. It starts to then behave in desperate ways. Let me give you an example of one of the most desperate. We've just had 30 years in which the gap between rich and poor has gotten much sharper in the United States, in which the top 10% have basically taken all of the productivity gains, all of the increase in output into their own hands, with everybody else kind of treading water. So you come to December 2017 and you have the rich have gotten much, much richer and everybody else is kind of squeezed. What any half-witted person would understand, this is not the time that you give a mammoth tax cut to the rich. They don't need it. And there's 10,000 other things more urgent in this society than to do that. But they did that. And they didn't just do it because Trump believes in it or because the Republicans controlled the Congress. That certainly helped, made it possible to do it quickly. But they did it because they have a basic problem. They don't want an economic downturn, and they are desperate. We barely got out of the last one. How are you going to rationalize to the American people that we just had a crash in 28, then we had 10 years of austerity and difficulty, and at the end of that, we're going to give you another shot, another downturn. I mean, you're starting to stretch the credulity, stretch the toleration of an economic system that works like this. So they can't do that. They need to give this economy another boost. So they did. They cut taxes for corporations, you all remember, from 35% to 21%. They cut taxes for rich people, and they even cut taxes for the average person. And to really boost the economy, they increased government spending on a whole bunch of social programs at the same time. Well, you all know, or you should, that if the government takes in much less money, that's what a tax cut is, while it spends more, it's got to get that money that it's spending more somewhere, and it's not getting it from its revenue. So what the government did is borrow. So the deficit went up crazy. The deficit went up staggeringly, and it was done by the Republicans, who for the last 20 years have been the big fighters against deficits. Suddenly all of that disappeared. Now, this is not about they're not telling the truth or they don't. Of course they don't. They're politicians in America. What do you expect? But that doesn't answer the question, why did they do that? Well, they did it because they got to keep this crazy system going, and it's not easy to do. You got to give it an enormous boost. And UBS, Goldman, and JP Morgan Chase, that's their argument. we're going to go down in 2019 and 2020 because we're going to run out of the little juice we got from the December 2017 tax. And the underlying reality is terrible. And once that juice up passes, once it's spent, we're back to where we were, only even harder because we have an enormous deficit, which we're afraid could come and haunt us, which is why the interest rates are going up, to make the cost of that deficit more expensive, right? If we owe, the United States owes $20 trillion roughly in its debt, if the interest rates go up, then the government has to generate more money each year to pay interest on that debt. Where's that money going to come from?
From the people we didn't tax.
That's right. They're going to tax you. Or they're going to cut the public services to free up the money to use now to pay to whoever owns the federal debt, which is mostly wealthy people. Whoa. Whoa. These are dead-end choices. Each one is worse than the next one. This is an economy in terrible, difficult circumstances. I think I've told you the story in the past, I'll tell it again. Because I went to the fancy universities here in the United States, all the right ones. I did. Because of that, I know all these people. It's a small circle. Sitting next to me in my PhD classes at Yale, where I got my PhD, one of my classmates there was a woman named Janet Yellen. Okay? One of my teachers was, well, anyway, it's not important. I know all those people and they know me, and occasionally we get together for a drink or have dinner. And we have, in the last few months, had a remarkable time. We don't agree on how the country got into this situation. We never did agree. And we don't agree how to get out of it. And we never did. But we sit there and we look at each other and we are astonished, each of us in turn, by the fact that there is something we agree on. And here's what it is. That the United States has not been in this bad an economic situation ever before in our lifetimes. That we agree on. And then we resume disagreeing on why it's like that and what to do about it. But I think it's remarkable that we agree on that, and I think it's a sign that there's a lot more that you ought to be worried about here than perhaps has affected you. Okay, let's turn then to the topics on the agenda. I've answered the question, is another crash coming? No one knows in advance exactly when it comes. If you encounter someone who tells you it's going to happen in November of 2019, talk to somebody else. That's silly. To think you can predict that is childish. Nobody can do that, number one. Number two, capitalism, wherever it has settled for 300, 400 years, has always been an unstable system. It has always had what some people call crises, other people call business cycles, other people call downturns, or lots of words, because it's always there. And on average, it's every 4 to 7 years. That's the average range between downturns. So the last major downturn was 2008, 2009. So you add, this is the kind of math economists are good at, you add 4 to 7 to 2009, and you can kind of get the idea we're overdue. That doesn't mean it's an average, so it doesn't have to be each time that way, but we're overdue. If you add to we're overdue a number of other factors that are crowding in on us, like major conflict with the second most important economy in the world, that's a big one. Conflict with our erstwhile allies because we don't agree on how to deal with China or Iran or any of the other cases where there's real fights. If I had time, I would stop and talk to you about the Iran story because it's extremely important. Not so much about Iran as it is about the conflict between the United States and Europe. The United States is putting sanctions back on Iran. But the sanctions include punishing any company that does business with Iran. That means a French company, for example, the company Total, it's a big oil company in France. The company Total has a big contract of oil dealings with Iran, has had it for years. They just canceled it. They're afraid of what the United States will do to harm them if they continue to trade with Iran. At that point, the French economics minister, Bruno Le Maire, went crazy because it's the end of French sovereignty. A French company based in France is now making decisions on whether or not it trades with Iran, a major partner for it, not based on the French government or the French society or the French elections, but on Mr. Trump, which means they're not sovereign anymore. Mr. Trump is making policy for the... They're crazy about that. They're very angry, very upset. What you saw, that little theater between Trump and Macron around the World War I exhibit the other day, that's really more about the Iran and those other issues than it is about insulting one another, however pleasurable that is, around the World War I memorial. These tensions are very serious. If you know something about European history and Western history, these are the kinds of troubles that ended up in World Wars I and II. And we can dismiss them and so we comfort ourselves that it won't get that far this time, and it may not, but it may. And these are extraordinary issues. The French public, the German public, they really do hate Mr. Trump. One of the reasons he can't go on a lot of places and visits is because he can't go. Because they're going to say things and do things and throw things, and it's not so good. And that has consequences. Okay, let's turn to the elections. One of the interesting things about the elections was the continuing growth of a socialist presence in the United States. I'm going to talk about things about the elections that you haven't read in the major newspapers. Otherwise, why do you come here? You don't need me to repeat.
You're our Wednesday John Oliver.
What?
You're our Wednesday John
No,
Oliver.
that's true too. That's true too. Occupy, Black Lives Matter, Bernie, they've all helped to make it possible. And I think, I speak only for myself, but I hope many of you agree, that we all owe them an enormous debt. Whatever our agreement or disagreement with this and that about what they do, they are opening the space politically in this country after half a century of taboo. It's like a country coming out of hibernation, like we're all bears coming out of the caves where it was impossible to talk about these things without having people look at you as if you either were crazy or an agent of Moscow or something else like that. Nowadays, it's suddenly okay. It's okay to talk about it. I do an awful lot of interviews now on radio and television, and the people there ask me all about socialism as if it were another topic. It's really like another world. 5 years ago, that would never have happened. Now it's okay. It's okay. Ocasio-Cortez here in the Queens, she's like an icon. She's everywhere, and she has a lovely smile, and she makes socialism downright attractive, you know. And Bernie, in his way, also does that sort of thing. And there were several others that were elected this last round. So it's growing. It's systematically growing. And I hope later to give you the details once they're worked out. I got invited to do a debate in Soho here with an editor of Barron's magazine around the proposition socialism is the only humane arrangement for societies to live in. I am going to be in favor, this comes as a shock, and this fellow who's the editor at Barron's is going to be opposed. But this is all their initiative. I didn't have anything, they just invited me, but that's what they want. They want to talk.
He did that same debate last month with the editor of Jacobin, Socialism versus Capitalism, the editor of Barron's and the...
He's a past editor, he's not the editor now. Epstein is his name.
Yeah.
Gene Epstein. Anyway, I will announce that once we have the details worked out. Anyway, this emergence of socialism means we have to talk a few minutes, you and me, about what the word means, because that's murky. Now, mostly, as best I can tell, I hope I'm not being unfair, but I'm connected in ways with Bernie's campaign and so forth. I know those people, and they know me and all that. in the words of most of them, in the minds of most of them, and in what they say, socialism is, by and large, having the government do a lot of good things for the average person. In Bernie's case, he literally speaks of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the kind of model, as the kind of leadership he would like to replicate, more or less. Now, you remember, Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not use the word socialism to describe what he did. But Bernie has done what many, many socialists have done, whether or not they use that adjective democratic socialist or not. Some do, some don't. They have used it mainly to mean that the government should have a national health program, and the government should provide free education, or at least close to that, and the government should create an absolute minimum, like a minimum basic income, that's another idea floating around, and so forth. It's a notion that what distinguishes socialism from capitalism is the role of the government in general and the role of the government as a support for the direct needs of the mass of people. That's the kind of thing. And that if it's required to do that by taxing wealth and high incomes and corporations, that's fine. That's what we should do, and we should do a lot of that, and that's what the society needs. And if you elect us, that's what we'll do. Okay? And that is one use of the term socialism. I think it's fair not only about the democratic socialists that are emerging here, the DSA organization and all of that, but in many of the European socialist parties, some of which are very large and many of which are powerful, that's their image pretty much also. They may disagree on these or that details. Scandinavian socialism is sort of like that, and German and Italian and French socialism are like that. The Labour Party was like that, but the Labour Party, I'm going to come back to them, in England is pushing further, which is really interesting because it's only their new leadership. They have a Bernie over there too, but they call him Jeremy. Jeremy Corbyn instead of Bernie Sanders. But they're about the same age, I think, and they are long-time political activists. But Corbyn has gone considerably further than Bernie has, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. The problem is socialism is not limited to that particular definition. Socialism has always been, and this is really important that everybody understands, has always been a contested issue. From the earliest days, socialists didn't agree with each other. They developed different ways of understanding socialism, different plans and programs if they were elected, or if they took over the government through a revolutionary procedure. They had disagreements. There's nothing new or different. It's not a sign that socialism is decaying, that it has disagreement. Probably runs the other way, that if there isn't disagreement, you got bigger problems. Something must be happening to shut it down. The first time it got really shut down was with the Russian Revolution, because the Russian Revolution produced a problem for socialists. Remember, the Russian Revolution was made at a time when all the different kinds of socialists all used the name socialist. They didn't use the name communist. Very, very rare. There was the label of that manifesto they wrote back in 1848, but there wasn't no communists. There were no communist parties. The communist parties came out of Russia because when the Russians made a revolution, they imposed on the socialist world a tremendous question. Wow. We've been running around opposing capitalism, criticizing capitalism, building trade unions, contesting elections, but we never won anywhere. Now we got a new problem. We just won in this weird country, Russia, very poor, very big, and we won. That surprised, believe me, it surprised Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin as much as it surprised anybody else. Now we're in charge. And now we have to do something. Run the country, which is a very different business than being an opposition, as every opposition has learned if you get into that situation. Well, very quickly they began to do what seemed to them to be reasonable. And that's not what we're going to talk about now. But what I am going to make sure you understand is that when the Russians began to do something, they did it with unspeakably great prestige. They were the ones who won. It made every socialist everywhere else say, well, maybe I should do like them because they won. So what are we doing here in France or Spain or wherever, doing our things that are different from them because we have a different idea of socialism? But I mean, after all, they won. They must have figured out how to do it. That's why Lenin had the prestige that he did, in good part. Yes, he was a very sophisticated thinker, and he wrote an unbelievably body of work and all that. But the thing was, he won. They won. And you had an enormous split in the socialist world between those who said, we must be like them because they found the way. They are the ones who won. Those people dropped out of the word socialism and took the name communist. That's when all the communist parties were formed in 1918, 1920, 1921. Before that, there was no American Communist Party. There was no any Communist Party. Didn't have them. They were the socialists who wanted to follow Russia, who joined the Comintern and the organizations that were built around the Soviet Union. And the other socialists became critical of Russia, sometimes very profoundly. Many of you have been active. You know that the Trotskyite movement has a long, bitter history of animosity with the ones who were close to Moscow, because Stalin and Trotsky had a tremendous falling out, and they became great enemies, even though they were both socialists and all the rest of it. So I tell you this only that what I'm about to tell you, which is that socialism has reacted over the last 30 years to what happened in Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union, to the changes in China, to the changes in Vietnam, in Cuba, and to the whole history. It wasn't just the West that responded to all of that with triumphalism. We won, we defeated them. I don't know how many of you read the famous article written by Robert Heilbronner, who was a professor at the New School. He wrote an article that begins, in the great struggle between capitalism and socialism, that's now resolved. Capitalism won, socialism lost. And this was a socialist who wrote that. Well, the fact is, socialism, whatever you think of win and lose, socialism has changed. And one of the directions it has changed in, very, very important for me, so I want to tell you where I'm coming from here, is that it's a kind of socialism that is critical, not in a dismissive way, but in a hopefully a constructive way, critical of the focus of the old socialists on the state, on the notion that the state is what we need, the state to do this good thing, the state to do that good thing. Socialists have worried about that because if you give the state the power to do all those good things, you run a risk, which is with that amount of power, which you need to do the good things, you can also choose to do not so good things with that power. And that clearly has happened, and therefore has to be taken account of in some way. How do you deal with that? What's your response as a socialist to that situation? We know what the enemies of socialism do. They point to those kinds of behavior as a reason to reject socialism. Socialists aren't going to do that, but they are going to ask what else could it mean? And one of the major directions that is being taken now, and that I am part of, is to see socialism less at the macro level of society, at the big level, and more at the level of the enterprise. The workshop, the office, the store, the factory. That what socialism means, and this comes out of a reading of Marx, to which it is indebted, is a reorganization of the production process so that the relationship employer-employee is done away with. It's a kind of a notion of capitalism as having been a historical case of misunderstanding. That capitalism grows out of a rejection of the dichotomy of slavery, master-slave. And it grows out of a rejection of the dichotomy of feudalism, lord, serf. It was to free people from all of that. Liberty, equality, fraternity, democracy, all these terms are get rid of that. And yet the economic system that establishes those slogans also establishes another dichotomy: employer, employee. And in this view, that's the fundamental problem. That's why you couldn't realize the slogans of the French and American Revolution. You never got liberty, equality, fraternity, or democracy. You got fakeries of it, formalities of it, but not the substance of it. Because you didn't break from the dichotomy master-slave, lord-serf, employer-employee. So what would it mean then to be a socialist? It would mean to end that dichotomy, or to use the language of Marx, to end exploitation, a situation where a mass of people produces a surplus that a small number of people gather into their hands, as most of us do in a corporation where the board of directors plays that role. You have to end that, which is a dramatic, daring bit. You have to end that and say that the democracy of the workplace is what socialism means. It means that everybody who works in any place, factory, store, office, one person, one vote, make the decisions. What to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits that everybody has helped to generate. Whether you call that a worker co-op or a commune, there's a lot of language issues, but that's a fundamental break that ends the dichotomies of slavery, feudalism, and that capitalism didn't end them. It just changed the form. It substituted employer-employee for what those had been. And for this kind of a socialism, that transformation at that point is what was missing in the Soviet Union and what was missing in China. There were efforts, there were some experiments, but we've had experiments in that in this country too. We still do. I talk sometimes about Mondragon in Spain because they try to do that. Or I talk about the Alvarado Street Bakery, for those of you who know, in Northern California, which is very successful at doing this and for decades. Or the Arizmendi bakeries, also in the Bay Area, and so forth and so on. That socialism, I think, is wending its way to an extraordinary change in what it means. And that change is going to be contesting with the older notions of socialism about the state and the importance of the state and the intervention of the state. And I think that in this country particularly, and it'll be different in other countries, but in this country, we have also a peculiarity. We have a long history of demonizing the state. So that people have had that association, powerful state, socialism. And so they're kind of prepared, they're trained to be hostile and skeptical and oppositional. But when you talk to them about socialism as the transformation of the workplace, they find the idea intriguing. They find the use of the word democracy to apply to the workplace as a way to make it palatable. Yes, I'm a Democrat, yes. When I go around and I say, look, you like democracy in the political, why the hell don't you want it in the economic? If you want to be able to vote for who leads you in politics, why don't you want to vote for whoever leads you in economics? Why is the boss not subject to your approval? He makes decisions, or she does, that affect your life, but you don't participate. You have no control at all. You claim to be in favor of democracy, but you don't have it in the workplace, which is where you spend most of your adult life. Hello? So how come you're not upset about being deprived of your democracy where you work? And why is it that the United States never installed democracy in its workplaces? Ever. A country that goes around the world dropping bombs on people to bring democracy to them doesn't have it itself to bring. Bizarre. And we got rid of all the kings, and we said to ourselves as a human population, we don't need kings. Remember the kings, monarchy? Not so long ago, there was a king, and he said, you are all my subjects. You need me. I talk to God 2 or 3 times a week, and I work things out, and that's why you're not dead. So you need me. You can't make decisions. You're stupid. You're poor. Look at you. I am riding around in a coach. I have 8 million servants. I have wonderful painters decorating my walls. You live in a hovel. Obviously, God wants me to be in charge, but He wouldn't want you to be in charge. And you couldn't have a society without the leadership of a king. And at a certain point, the human race separated these kingly types from their heads. Their heads rolled down a hill. I'm not suggesting anything. The heads rolled down the hill. The rest of them was left, wasn't pretty. And after 5 years, nobody missed them. We have parliaments and we vote and we do all that. And yet we seem to believe that when we go to work, there has to be a king. The CEO has to have the power. A tiny group of people, a board of directors, 15 to 20 people in most corporations, no matter whether they have hundreds of thousands of employees, these 15 people are endowed with unspeakable power that's accountable to nobody who works under them. That's not democracy, folks. That's the opposite. That's monarchy at work. That's what we have. We have a monarchical work system, and socialism is its enemy. Socialism points it out. Socialism exposes it. Socialism makes it an issue, and socialism has the solution. This is scary. Socialism says, here's an alternative. Let us democratize the enterprise. It's a collective process, and we're going to run it as a democracy, and we're not going to be scared off by terrible predictions that there has to be a boss. Really? Really? There has to be a boss. That says more about you than about the boss, that you think that. Are you that little? Are you that afraid? Not just of your own power, but of the power of working people like you? I don't think the American people, let me push it politically, I don't think the American people are ready for this. I mean that in a good way. When we say it, they don't have the defenses organized. They have a lot of defenses against the government coming in and telling us what to do. They got lots of training in how to dispel that. But having a democratic workplace, we're catching them unaware, unprepared. This is a way to tell them what socialism is that makes it look really good. The truth of it is the socialism in the United States is the old kind, not yet this new kind. Even worse, if you look at the big polls, Gallup polls and others have shown that the young people, particularly in America, are now 50-50 on this socialism versus capitalism. Sometimes socialism wins, gets more than capitalists. But it's very clear when you talk to students, like I do all the time, young people, that this is not a measure of their desire and interest in socialism. It's a measure of their alienation from capitalism, which is disappointing them and frustrating them and angering them over and over again. And that's fine, that's the way it starts. But we're now entering, and that's why I'm doing this, we're entering a period where it's going to become more and more important that we understand and debate amongst ourselves these alternative notions of what socialism is, where it could go, what it might mean in terms of the political changes coming in this country. The more we are open to socialism, the more the differences within socialism will also return to the public conversation, just like the concept of socialism has. Shoot.
And so in your view of socialism, how would you deal with universal health care, which probably is better done by the government for everybody?
I try when I do this, speaking around the country, not to offer the notion of the focus on the enterprise and the organization as an alternative. Even in my speech to you just now, I went a little bit too far. It's the missing element that has to be added. It's not an opposition to government having all kinds of functions that it should have. Absolutely. If things are done better by the government, let's have the government do them. If things are done better by non-governmental, let's have that. That never was the, how do I put this? You won't find in Marx a big debate about public versus private. I think he would have thought that bizarre and beside the point. It's not whether it's public or private, it's how it's organized. In that public health, will that be a democratic workplace, that public clinic, or not? If the government takes over the steel factory so that the workers, instead of reporting to the board of directors, report to the commissars who have the same function, then you haven't transformed the workplace. You've transformed who the people are who sit at the top of it, but its pyramid shape is still there. So the question is, you want to transform, then you transform both the public and the private. But the choice between the two is a much secondary issue. Another way to understand that is the history of slavery and feudalism. There were public slaves and private slaves. Private people owned slaves, but so did states. Private people had serfs, but so did states. Capitalism is a private system, but also states have employees. That's never been the issue. That is an adjustment each society makes as it prefers a bit more of the state or a bit less of the state. But that's not at the core issue of what this system is like. That's a different matter. And for me, as I read Marx, as a person I study, this is the message. It's the transformation of the relations of production, how you relate to one another in the production process, and what it means, and how it will transform you. I mean, bear with me for a minute, and I will only take 5 more minutes, I promise. Imagine your life if you worked in a democratic workplace. You wouldn't then just have one job description. You'd always have 2. Whatever particular job you do in the division of labor, plus your participation in designing and running the business, because there's nobody who has only one function. No overling, underling. No design director and the directed. That's what we're getting rid of. And that's going to be an adjustment. We're going to have to change our schooling. We're going to have to change our whole conception of what it is to make a young person into an adult. You have to be able to take charge. You have to have that confidence in yourself, and you have to learn not to have confidence that there's somebody who's going to do it better to you. Just like you have to learn not to look for the next king just because you killed the first one. You know, maybe the issue wasn't to get rid of John in order to have Henry, but to get rid of the whole business. By the way, you know, we just changed our laws in this country to allow inheritance of all of this enormous wealth that has been concentrated. So we now are going to have, unless we do something, we're going to have dynasties. Not like on television, real ones. Mr. Bezos is going to be, the name Bezos will have a bigger kind of constant reference that the names Rockefeller and Carnegie used to have, because this is even more of a concentrated wealth. We're going to be a country of dynasties whose children are going to have the privileged positions in the media and in the arts and in politics because they are the child or the cousin or the nephew of the right family. I mean, all of these things will transform our society. A couple of things about the elections that I have to say before we go. Elections are always best understood if they are not looked at only for what the election was about. Always just as important is what the election was not about. What was not put up for a vote is at least as important as what was. This is an old Hegelian dialectic notion. Every presence is woven into an absence. The election made some things present and it made other things absent. There's the image, you know, the metaphor of the flashlight in the dark room. If you need to get across a dark room, you go for a flashlight and you turn it on and you point the flashlight into the darkness, and it does something wonderful. It illuminates a whole bunch of the obstacles that are in that room. But behind the obstacle, everything is a shadow. Your very flashlight throws into the shadows what is behind the object illuminated. A flashlight therefore hides at the same moment that it illuminates. Everything is like that. Everything is this unity of the oppositions, and you make big mistakes if you don't see the opposite in everything. The good with the bad, the strong with the weak, and all of the rest of it. We are all crumpled up objects. There was no opportunity in this election to vote for capitalism versus socialism. It's a big issue in a lot of people's minds. Absent. Unavailable. You couldn't do it. Most people didn't even know if they had a candidate who had a position on socialism, what it was. Because those candidates kept it to themselves for whatever reasons. You had no chance. You could vote very demonstrably whether you were for or against immigration or guns that you can buy. There were issues that were put forward, and election should be about those. But much more interesting than what the election is what is kept from it, what is kept out of it. And another thing to understand about elections, and we'll maybe say something again when we meet in 2 months, 48% of the American eligible voted. In other words, once again, the majority of people in the United States didn't bother. This is very important. Even though we had a higher turnout for a midterm election than midterm elections usually have, that's true, but we still didn't manage to get a majority of the American people. The majority of the American people didn't go to the corner firehouse or the school or wherever the hell their voting place was. And it's very hard not to come away with the thought that there's not enough at stake for them to make it worthwhile. So they stayed home and watched TV or forgot about it or had a beer or whatever else they did, because what was the point? And I don't think those are bad people, and I don't think those are, I think they're making a mistake. That's another matter. The interesting question is only why? What is this? And so here's the answer, my last point for today, I think. No, it's not that I think it's the last point. It's something that I think. Capitalism has always had a terrible trouble with elections and voting. In a system of universal suffrage, where everybody is, at least in general, eligible to vote, which we, the people, have fought long and hard for centuries to get that right. You all know that the initial United States, after our revolution, a tiny proportion of the people were eligible to vote. You had to be a man, you had to be white, you had to be property owner. I mean, when you did it, I don't know what the percentage was, but I'm sure it wasn't more than 10%, if that, of the people were eligible to vote. So it took a long time to get universal suffrage. But capitalism has a terrible problem. It has all the economic control in the hands of a small minority of people. The owners of businesses and the boards of directors that the owners elect, those are the people who run the businesses. That's a tiny minority of our population. They're always in danger that the majority, having the right to vote, will use the vote to undo what these people get out of the economy they control. In other words, their control, no matter how much they tell themselves, we are the owners of the business, we are the proprietor, the bottom line is the mass of people could reduce that to nothing in 2 seconds. Put a tax on it, you're done. Appropriate it, it's gone. Change the terms of employment, you don't make the decisions at all. They're constantly, so for them, the issue is always to prepare the population so that the election never does what it could do, so that it's an empty potentiality never realized. That's why the politics of the people who run this society is not about elections. It's about all the time other than elections, which they have to use so that by the time the election comes, it's not going to do anything. And they've succeeded at that. It doesn't do much. The first reaction in the Wall Street Journal after the results on the 6th of November was, oh, we're going to have gridlock. Good. Then the government will not bother us. They'll be fighting each other. That was the first reaction. Gridlock, when the Republicans have the Senate and the Democrats have the House, so they won't get anything done because one side will negate what the other one does. Fine, said the business community. They were fine with Mr. Trump. Now they're fine with less Trump. And in 2 years, they may be fine with no Trump at all. Because they've done all the work necessary, so by the time the election comes, between what the issues are and aren't, and what the candidates are and aren't, they've taken care of it. The left, by contrast, seems still fixated on the election, as if something magical was going to happen at the election that was different from what everything happens all day. If there's no left organizations talking to people, bringing up issues, explaining things, they have the media to do that. They have the universities to do that. They have the teaching and educational systems and the churches to do all that. We have to have the alternative institutions. Otherwise, by the time the election is coming, it doesn't matter for them at the top. And that may be the biggest clue to why 52% of the rest of Americans figured that out too. Thank you very much. I will see you in 2 months.